It's the problem with the participatory conferences, like people participate and talk. Okay, shh. All right, welcome back to this afternoon session. And this afternoon session kicks off with a wonderful panel that is focusing on unraveling the paradox of philanthropy, transforming from within the system. And we will be together for about an hour or so, and then I will reveal what happens next, which is almost as fun as this panel. So let me invite Daktari Una Osili to the stage, and she will introduce her panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome back from lunch. I hope you enjoyed the sessions, the opportunity to get a massage, play with your Legos, and any number of opportunities. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment and thank the organizers of this conference. There's so many of them who've put this together. It's such a thoughtful opportunity. And I'm especially thrilled that it is right here in Nairobi on the African continent. So let's give them a round of applause. Yes. So many of you usually have to get on planes to travel and cross continents and oceans, but today you get to stay at home and attend a conference. So we're going to get started. This afternoon, you're in for a treat. We have a thought-provoking panel, lots of discussion. It is not, I think we were told it was going to be controversial. It doesn't have to be controversial, but it's going to be lively. I'm going to encourage you to think of your questions, write them down, send them in. Hopefully we'll have time for a question and answer period. For those of you who are coming in, please take a seat. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panel, but before we do that, let's just quickly provide an overview. Today's conversation is titled Unraveling the Paradox of Philanthropy. And to kick us off on that lively discussion, we're joined by three amazing panelists. You probably have read their bios, you know something about their work, but I have to say from having spent time with each of them, they're bringing unique perspectives from their leadership roles, from their journeys in the civil society space, and also their global perspective. So to start the panel, we have Degan Ali, who is based here in Nairobi. I first met her actually at the Global Philanthropy Forum. She's a leader on the world stage, many decades of experience, and currently the executive director of ADESO, a civil society organization that serves the continent. Degan, join us here on the panel. I'm also thrilled to have my colleague Asha Curran join us from New York. So she is also someone who's frequently flying around the world. She leads Giving Tuesday. Many of you know it's a worldwide movement to encourage giving of all different types. She is also one of the 50 most influential people in the nonprofit sector and was recently awarded this just last month in Washington, D.C. So round of applause for Asha. And finally, a dear colleague and friend, Matthew Bishop. Many of you know him for his role at The Economist, but he's also a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and we were just reflecting. He's been making waves on the global stage for quite some time. A few decades ago, he was awarded the Young Global Leader Award, many of you know that, from the World Economic Forum, and has continued to build on that and has branched into many spaces, including the civil society space. So welcome, Matthew. Their full bios are in the program, so I'm not going to take too much of the time for that. We're going to jump right into the panel. So philanthropy. We define it as private action for the public good. It also has a much broader meaning, the love of humanity. Many of you know that. And in our conversations this morning alone, we've heard about the role of philanthropy in every single society that we know about in the world. In the past few years, we've had a global pandemic. We've had a racial and social justice movement. And finally, ongoing economic crises in many parts of the globe. philanthropy has had both positive reviews over this period, but also some very sharp critiques. Now, my name, I forgot to say, is Una Osuli. I'm the Associate Dean for Research at the Lilly Family School, and in my role, I help lead the Global Philanthropy Indices, which shows us that in every society in the world, philanthropy plays a strong role. But it also has some shortcomings and some inherent paradoxes. So to kick us off, while everybody's getting mic'd, I want you to start thinking about what are those contradictions inherent in philanthropy, and how can we reconcile them? Our panelists will have some strong views on this, and I'm going to ask them to really give us that perspective. Degan, you are going to kick us off. I hope that's okay. Coming from the global south, you can help set the stage, because what we talk about in the north might be quite different from what we talk about here in the south. On the African continent, philanthropy looks very different. So what would you say are those paradoxes that you see inherent in philanthropy? Maybe just name two.
It's hard to name just two, but I think generally Western philanthropy, I'll say, and Southern philanthropy is dramatically different. In Kenya, for instance, all the Kenyans know that when somebody dies, there's a fundraising that happens with family and friends. When a child is going to university, there's a fundraising that happens. When someone is traveling to the US and needs some support, there's a fundraising that happens. And it doesn't just go to the family and the friends. Sometimes I'm not even related to these people. Maybe it's a colleague or somebody I met, a taxi driver, who gets my number and he asks me to contribute, and we contribute. And so I think giving is an essential part of our DNA in the South. It's part of who we are. We do it every single day. And we don't think about it as philanthropy. But when white people give, they think of it as philanthropy. When we give, we think of it as just part of being a good member of the community and being a responsible member of the community. And we think of it as being a good human being that lives on this earth, because we recognize that we could all be in that position tomorrow and need it. Whereas I feel like in the West, you give, you have to be recognized, you get accolades, you get on the Forbes list, you start a foundation, you have an endowment, you get a tax deduction from the government. How many of us in the South give, and none of us have any tax deductions. We don't even think about the possibility of getting a tax deduction. So not only the regulatory systems are not in there, but we don't do it for those reasons. We do it because we're part of the community. This is our people. So I think that those are the massive paradoxes. And as a result of having those paradoxes, it manifests itself in this very hierarchical kind of way of giving that happens in the West, as I said, with these very that leads to foundations, that leads to endowments, that leads to 4,000 staff in a foundation, just to figure out how to give money properly. It leads to evaluations and metrics and really complicated RFPs, and it just keeps going on and on and on in this domino effect.
Degan, you've given us a lot to chew on, yes. I'm just going to lift up a few themes. Number one, philanthropy in the South is community-centered and community-focused. It's centered on the needs of the community. I think you've made that point. But also the definition is much broader. It's not defined to just what you do on one side, but really how you live your life. It's broader than just money. I think I'm taking that away. But you're also bringing up that as we move towards this more formalized way of giving, we introduce some complications, additional issues around power dynamics, around ethics, around who has the funds and who is receiving the funds. So you've given us a lot to digest, but also raising some ideas about how we can start to shift and change the system. So I'm going to ask the two panelists, this is going to be a tough act to follow, but to jump in here and specifically talk about what paradoxes do you see in the system, but also maybe hint at how we too, and how we start to fix it. So maybe Matthew, we'll start with you, and then we'll come to Asha.
Yeah, I mean, I think one paradox is that, in a way, philanthropy is or the money that's given away through philanthropy has the least strings attached to it imaginable, in terms of its pure form. This money could be used for really anything, and the people who are giving it there's no real requirement shaping what they give that money to. And so, in my writings, I've talked about how that should be a tremendously liberating thing, to have money that you can give to wherever you want to put it to help that place, person, organization achieve their dreams and improve the world that they're living in. And yet the paradox I find so often is that this money is used so unimaginatively. It comes with so many strings that put on the people you're trying to help. You're not actually asking what they want the money for, and so it's this sort of paradox of something that could be such a liberating source of money, often, just becoming self-defeating through its the way it's done. So that's a negative one. I mean, a more positive one is that I do think we are at a moment where, having gone through a long period where the world was dominated by an economic ideology of neoliberalism that really put profit making and GDP growth as the primary goal in society, philanthropy has made a comeback both at if you're a billionaire, it's now expected that you give away, you sign the giving pledge and promise to give away at least half your money by the end of your life. But also regular people are turning against this materialism and saying, actually, I want to be more of that kind of community giver that was mentioned, and that actually giving is, all the neuroscience is proving it, the psychology proves it. A person who gives is a happier person generally, and we all want to be happy. And I think people are realizing let's get back to that kind of philanthropy that is purposeful and building community rather than taking from community.
Fantastic. So really, lots of points also raised by Matthew. I think I'll start with the second one, the idea that we're at a moment where we're rethinking all of our systems, our economic systems, how they work for everyone, not just for a few, but also this notion of the love of humanity, how giving makes us all better people and better connected. So this is really a wonderful, but before I forget, one last point. Matthew raised the question of risk capital. To what extent are philanthropists taking risks? And we see in the data that although philanthropy theoretically should be taking the most risks, it tends to be perhaps the least risk-taking segment of our society. However, you could also say that it isn't necessarily accountable to anyone. How do we use that to benefit the sector as a whole? That is both a positive and a negative at the same time. So Asha, we're going to invite you in. Already we have lots of points, but you're going to add, hopefully, to our debate here. What are some inherent paradoxes in how philanthropy is practiced or conceived currently? And are there some elements in which we can start to think about how do we fix this?
Yeah, wow. I don't need to be that loud. So I think to add to all the brilliant things that have already been said, all of which I agree with, I think that we're in a moment, this is what I think a lot about right now, where there's just so many words, right? There's just like rhetoric and jargon and buzzwords. And I really do believe that there's good intentionality and genuine feeling behind the use of those words, but that we have yet to see them being put boldly and broadly into practice in a way that would be transformational. And so when we talk about things like localization and systems change and proximate leadership, et cetera, we're not looking at our own system. We're not changing anything about the system, the way we work in it. We're just thinking about that as being a matter of how capital flows. But it's much more than that. It's a complete mindset shift. And so I think there's a lot of potential there, but we could either glide right over this moment using a lot of buzzwords, right? Or we could actually make change and acknowledge that it is people in their communities who know how those communities need to be served and need to change, and that they should be leading that change, and that there are whole questions about how that works in practice. It's not simply the dispersing of more money to hyper-local organizations. And it is a greater appreciation of the other side of the role that institutions play in positive social change, and looking at the role that individuals play, and networked initiatives and movements and broader ecosystems of human beings, none of whom are at the top of the list to be really well supported now. And then I think one other thing that I'm hoping that we are shifting, certainly from my point of view we are, but then this is my day-to-day, the sort of relentless emphasis on high net worth giving as the solution to it all, when ordinary people, meaning some people call them everyday givers or grassroots givers or everyday donors, which I can't stand that word, have tremendous power, especially collectively. And I think there's far too little attention being paid to that.
Wonderful. So your point is, we often think about philanthropy as the big donors, the billionaire philanthropists, but philanthropy is exactly what Degan mentioned. It's everyday folks in communities around the world who are rising, giving their money, giving their time, giving their talents to help solve problems. And too often we're not looking at those communities as a source of the change that we're seeking. So I have taken away a lot just from these paradoxes. I'm not going to try to summarize right now, but just to say that on the positive side, philanthropy is bigger than just the monetary donations. It's not just the big donors. And we also have to look at why the system is not working and how we can fix it. So getting back to this big question, let's go to I think all of you have hinted at this, but we live in a time of great inequality. I was just at a conference recently where a lot was said about inequality, but the point that I took home was that at the very time when poverty may be declining, the gap between the wealthiest citizens and the poorest citizens is higher than ever before. COVID, in some ways, has made that more apparent to all of us. And it's not just a gap in income or wealth, but it's also a gap in opportunity. And we are in Kenya. Kenya has always been on the map as far as a high inequality, and that seems to have gotten worse during the pandemic. So let me just start by saying philanthropy benefits, it looks like, from inequality to some degree. Wealthy households have gained during this period. They have more to give away. And at the same time, we're calling on everyone to do more to help the neediest. One of the questions that came through the conference app that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and let's put this on the table, what can philanthropy do to help address inequality? We know that when too many people are left behind, society itself no longer works from a, of course, economic standpoint, but also from a political standpoint. But what can philanthropy do to confront what are maybe historic highs in inequality? Degan, you may have some ideas because you're actually working with communities. You're seeing how they're both being impacted by inequality, but what they're doing to solve it. So are there any solutions that are emerging in your work?
Before I answer that question, I would just like to go back to the whole thing about Western unbridled capitalism that leads to inequality, and the other extreme part of, or the spectrum, then goes to communism. And I think the unbridled Western capitalism that is based on inequality is what manifests this type of philanthropy that I talk about. That is, as I said, very hierarchical, very white male dominated, and it's the idea is that we have the solution, white saviorism, a lot of metrics and all of that. So I think there is a problem that we need to understand, that that type of capitalism naturally leads to that type of philanthropy. And I think what we need to be thinking about is how do we don't, obviously we're not suggesting, well, some people are suggesting communism as a solution and full egalitarian kind of system and no wealth inequality. I don't think that's realistic, honestly, but we have to think about ethical capitalism or something that's more principled. Having said that, going back to your question, and I think where philanthropy, let's say global north philanthropy, well, even global south philanthropy, one of the things that I fear is that we in the South, when we amass wealth, we follow in the footsteps of what our global north sisters and brothers have done, and we think that that's metrics of success. I have been, colonized. My brain was colonized in that way, and when I came into this sector, I thought bigger adesso is a better adesso. The more locations we were operating in, the bigger the budget was. Very much like this imperialistic thing of planting your flag as in many communities as possible and conquering these communities and saying with pride, I work in 180 countries like many NGOs do or UN agencies. That is success. And I learned through a very hard, difficult experience over the past few years that that's not success, and that shouldn't be our metrics of success. But it took a long time for me to make that pivot. So I worry that our global South philanthropists are following in the footsteps, and they might try those kind of heavy, hierarchical, top-down type of philanthropy. But I think where philanthropy has an option or the opportunity to really make things make some real change happen is that it has the flexibility. It can be a de-risker. It can be the one that takes the risks and moves the needle in the right direction and helps resource that new emergent infrastructure that we want to create or that new ecosystem that we want to create. Or you can go to the extreme part of the spectrum like Langley Chase Foundation. Sorry, I can never pronounce it properly. Julian, to put you on the spot, what they did was just basically say, we're going to get out of the way. We were part of this colonial system in amassing our wealth, and our solution is just to close down and give our wealth to groups and institutions that are really trying to have impact on the ground and get out of the way and not be the center of everything. And so that's one option, but I would also say another option is following in the footsteps of Mackenzie Scott and giving large grants that's completely unrestricted, completely 100% trust-based, and resourcing groups and organizations that are trying to work on what that new emergent system could look like.
Fantastic. So I am taking away one thing, and this is especially important for all of these groups here who are here from the Global South. And I feel an affinity, I would say, to the Global South as well, because I grew up in Nigeria and definitely so excited to be back on the African continent. So Degan, your point is a very, very salient one. There isn't one way to practice philanthropy. And we have to start to look at the models we have here in the Global South and see how we can share them with the rest of the world. Our panel, our session earlier this afternoon showed, of course, the growing middle class on the African continent, but also the rising group of wealthy African households. They have an opportunity to show a new way of giving, of being philanthropists, and it doesn't have to be the Western model. And I think that's one point that you're making. The other point is that in the West as well, we're seeing new models emerge, not one way of practicing philanthropy. Mackenzie Scott gave away $6 billion in 2020. All of it was unrestricted. Not one single grant came with strings attached. That's certainly a new model. And I'll give you one example. One university that received her $40 million gift did not get any grant reporting requirements. Giving Tuesday did not either. And what the donor said was, we trust you to make good decisions with this gift, and we're giving you this funding completely unrestricted. So that's a new model to put on the table. Asha, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Asha was one of those Mackenzie Scott beneficiaries or recipients. She got a completely unrestricted, I think we should give her a round of applause, because her story is also a very good one. Same thing, you didn't have any reporting requirements, no compliance reporting. Tell us a little bit about that journey and what you think the lessons are around trust-based and unrestricted grants.
Sure. I mean, trust-based philanthropy is a phrase that I have very mixed feelings about, because who's deciding who's trustworthy? Still the same people, right? Again, it's more words unless we actually see it in practice. I think David is absolutely right that the question of philanthropy addressing the wealth gap, addressing income inequality is is asking how philanthropy can address a terrible symptom of a disease that it itself is part of the system that helped create the disease, and that's not an answer, right? The symptoms definitely need to be addressed, and philanthropy should take its part in doing that, but it's not going to cure that problem. It's part of it. That has to be a question for government. It has to be a question for the private sector. It has to be a question for how we structure our taxes, the whole 9 yards. I agree that I think philanthropy is much more interesting when people's basic needs are taken care of. They're fed, they're sheltered, and to the extent that there is philanthropy, it can focus on longer time horizon innovations and experiments and risks and collaborations. But that's not what we're seeing right now. And philanthropy that is more transformational than it is transactional, I don't think we're there yet either. The Mackenzie Scott thing is a really interesting question, because I was very grateful, obviously, to get that gift. And the year after I got it was one of the most productive professional years I have ever had. I slept well. I had more than a 3-month runway. I felt great. I was brimming with imagination. And I thought that, other people might indeed follow in her footsteps, but they didn't. And there's absolutely no sign that that's going to happen. And so now Giving Tuesday, and everybody else I know who received a Mackenzie Scott gift is looking at what the next phase is now that they've staffed up against that higher revenue, right? And they've increased their budgets, and but there are no more Mackenzie Scotts coming my way, and it's back to the same old, right, system of asking for much smaller grants to try to equal the whole. The other thing about the Mackenzie Scott model is I really enjoy having a thought partnership with my funders, right? It's not that way with every funder, but where I feel like they're not saying they know how to do my job better than I do, but they have skills I don't have, they have knowledge I don't have, same exact way. If there's a lateral relationship there, I really enjoy it. It's a co-creative process. So I like the idea of philanthropy giving money and getting out of the way, but I wonder if that's enough, or if everybody switched to that model, if that would actually be the answer. We had our Giving Tuesday Africa Summit the past 2 days here, 17 of our 20 Giving Tuesday Africa countries, and one of our leaders from Liberia said something that I thought was so beautiful and really, really a good answer to this. He said, Giving Tuesday doesn't tell you what works. It asks you what you think is best for your own community, and then we walk alongside you. And I would love to see philanthropy adopt that mindset.
Okay, wonderful. Well, round of applause again.
Thank you.
So Matthew, I'm going to give you an opportunity to jump in here. We've heard two very different models proposed. Asha said, on one hand, we need more Mackenzie Scotts who will give unrestricted gifts, but we may also need funders who can bring some capital, not necessarily funding, ideas, partnership, networks, and so forth. What is the balance here? If philanthropy is to address inequality, is this going to be in the Mackenzie Scott vein, unrestricted, get out of the way? Is there a role for partnership? What do you see? You've seen a lot in your work. What has worked? Maybe give us some examples in terms of philanthropy addressing root causes, perhaps, and inequality in particular.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions. One thing is that I'm chair of the jury of the Catalyst 2030 Awards, which Catalyst 2030 is a sort of social entrepreneur-led organization that was founded 3 or 4 years ago to really, and the purpose of the awards is to highlight those allies that are funding social entrepreneurs in a way that can drive collaborative systems change. And so Mackenzie Scott was one of our first winners, precisely because what she is doing is giving money without restrictions, which is one aspect of, you've got to do a lot of research and pick people that organizations that are systemic in their focus to support, but at least she gave the money and let you do what you want with it. I mean, the striking thing is that we haven't seen the number of donors doing that kind of giving really increase very much, judged by the number of entries we get and nominations for those awards. So that is a mystery to me, and it was a shame that, in a way, both Darren Walker at Ford and also similar philanthropists, Fran Perrin and others in London, during COVID, a bunch of these big philanthropies got together and said, we're going to not impose the restrictions that we put in place on our grants, and we're going to let organizations spend the money the way they did. I hope that was going to be the turning point where we would then see philanthropy do a lot more of that, the organized philanthropists, and I haven't seen the momentum from that, so I earnestly wish that we could get back to that. And the second area, I think, where I'm much more clear than I was a few years ago, is that we should entertain the idea of simply giving people that we're trying to help money rather than telling them how to spend it and trying to intermediate to get in the way of how they do it and monitor how they do it, because all these experiments that we've seen in the last few years with direct cash donations have actually been surprisingly positive. There have been some that haven't worked so well, some have worked better, but I think as a minimum, philanthropists should ask themselves the question, is whatever I'm asking people to do or funding better than just simply giving them the cash? And if they can't answer that with some degree of confidence, they should just give them the cash. So that would be a revolutionary thing if that happened. But I also, at the same time, I do think, there's a question you can have philosophically about a world where everyone was equal. Would you need philanthropy or not? A world where governments function properly, would you need philanthropy? And that's a very interesting philosophical debate, and some people would say you would only need it in a world where neither the donor knew they were making a donation or the recipient knew they were getting it, which that's pure philosophy and not much use to me as a practical person. But I do think the reality of the world we're in is that you have a power structure and a wealth structure that is very, very unequal. And so a lot of what I've been writing about with things like philanthrocapitalism is, if you have got a lot of money, what should you do with it? And if you're someone that feels a degree of responsibility and that you have these powerful networks and things, how do you use your wealth and other networks and influence to actually do good? And also in that conversation, I do think it needs to be much more of a two-way conversation than it usually is historically. But I would say, it's been interesting to watch Bill Gates, who I've interviewed on many occasions. The last time I saw Bill Gates, he was very, very excited because he had spent, he said, like several hours a day for a good week or so talking to Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat senator, who he helped persuade to vote for something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which, according to Gates, was the single most positive piece of government legislation to address the battle against climate change that's ever been passed, and has unleashed hundreds of billions of dollars to support renewable energy. And what he did, only a very rich billionaire could do, which is to get access to these senators and tell them, you've got to do the right thing here. So I think we can't be, there's a world we'd like to see, and there's a world we're dealing with which we would like to marginally improve, and some of those marginal improvements can have massive consequences. And I also think when you look at the history of social movements, certainly in the West, even the most radical social movements have had some rich donor providing them with money. I mean, if you look back at the abolitionists, they were a bunch of bankers in London that were the Clapham sect, Christian bankers essentially, that funded the anti-slavery movement in the UK. You see similar stories all over the world, and so I think a culture in which it's expected of rich people that they give back is something we want to create, even if we don't like the economic system that's produced so many rich people.
Wow, so lots to unpack there. I'm going to try to summarize very quickly. If I miss anything, please let me know. But the first is speaking to funders. Number one, unrestricted giving. You heard that from all three panels.
Something that happens between a benevolent giver and a needy getter, right? Whereas I think a vision of generosity that is much, much more based on solidarity and mutuality and acknowledgement of our shared humanity that is not rooted in money at all would be much more transformational over the long run.
Okay, very good. Well, I think that's a good note to come back to the theme. Transforming philanthropy is our theme. And so that leads me to one question. Do we really even need philanthropy? Maybe the most radical thing we can do, which is what some of the critics have been calling for, is just to tax the wealthy more. And in that world, do we still have a role for philanthropy? I know that all the panelists have some thoughts on that, but I see that Degan is jumping in here. And I just want to say one thing on that. Let's keep in mind, there are many things that philanthropy can do. It's not just the safety net, it's also the innovation and risk capital, and it's also what I call the inspiration capital, the part that maybe governments cannot fund, or the private sector cannot supply. So Degan, over to you.
Yeah, I think let's go back to the question of why are we even needed? I think we need to understand the whole reason why we are poor as the Global South is by design. It's not by happenstance. And so I would love to see a situation where we don't need Harambes to pay for school fees for children in Kenya. I would love to see a situation where we don't need philanthropists to fund, Global North philanthropists to fund education and scholarships in the South. You know, we need to think about how we actually get ourselves out of a position of even being needy and what my mother calls professional beggars. And liberating ourselves. So for me, what is transformative about the Mackenzie Scott gift, and I will call it a gift, and she calls it a gift, and I think that was intentional, and it felt like a gift, because there's no strings attached to it, is what you do with it as an institution. And what we chose to do with it is say, we are going to liberate ourselves from this cycle of hunger and starvation and being donor dependent, and develop income for ourselves, develop businesses, commercial businesses and apartments and all types of things that we're doing with the money so that we in the future can have our own endowment and are no longer dependent on donors. To me, that's liberation. You know, that is decolonizing the system, is when we don't need Global North aid in Rwanda or Kenya. And we need to understand what are the root causes of that, and that is this unequal financial and global trade system. This is why so many of us in the South are so excited about what's happening with this multipolar world that's emerging with BRICS and what's happening in Francophone Africa. And in the North, you see the American newspapers, they're crying about Niger, where we are like applauding and saying, thank God, finally they're getting free. And so, you know, there's a huge kind of disconnect that's existing in the world. There's two separate worlds that are happening, taking place. And I don't think the Global North really appreciates the sense of anger and frustration and need for our own sense of sovereignty and independence.
I think I'm just going to try to recap. When we talk about transformation, you're saying we can't just look at things the way they are. We have to imagine a new type of way of operating, a new system without this power structure that has existed for a long time. And philanthropy can lead in that area. Mackenzie Scott is certainly one example, but we have African philanthropists who are also leaning into some of those models as well, giving those unrestricted gifts, and communities that are operating that way already. So I think those are really great points. Let's just think about a couple of other quick questions before we open it up. I know lots of you are eager to ask questions and participate in the debate. So I just want to ask the panelists very quickly to say how they think. Asha, you said we need to transform philanthropy. what are those things that would actually start to transform philanthropy? On this panel, we've talked about the accountability. Who are philanthropists accountable to? How can we create more accountability structures? If a foreign donor is giving money in an African country, who are they accountable to? What do we need to do to make foreign donors more accountable, local communities have more say in how things are being developed in their own countries, and maybe returning to that last question, do we actually need philanthropy in all of this? Are there other ways to bring some of these solutions to the table? So I'm going to ask you to answer these two questions side by side if possible. Matthew, I don't know if you want to, do I need to rephrase a little bit the two questions, or you understand?
Just say once more.
Okay. All right, so two things. I'm trying to join two questions. Can we make philanthropy more accountable? And this is for countries that are coming in with donations. Or, at the same time, how can we make the system itself? Does philanthropy play a role in making the system more equal to start with?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I would say, philanthropy should not, I would not view it as the enemy. And I think it's important to understand that for all its flaws, I think it is a positive force in the West and can be in the global South. And I worry a lot that all sorts of countries, particularly countries run by autocratic leaders, are now defining philanthropy and civil society as foreign agents and negative forces in the world. And I think in a way the danger is that because we rightly are pointing out some of the flaws in the way philanthropy works, maybe that's helping to contribute to what is an increasingly hostile space for philanthropy to operate in. And I think that would be a huge loss if we, whatever we think the ideal would be if we had a very equal world, which we don't. I think for now we need philanthropy to be more accountable and do a better job, but we don't need it to be shut down. I want more people to sign the Giving Pledge and actually give the money away like Mackenzie Scott is doing. And I want more Africans to join the Giving Pledge, and we got four have signed the Giving Pledge. And I also think you take a philanthropist like Mo Ibrahim, who I think is in a way was the first African probably or second to sign the Giving Pledge, and has really made accountable government his big theme, and trying to, because he feels like his message is, I think Africa is ready to decide for itself how it wants to be governed, and having data about how it's doing and having an internal debate about that is a good thing to happen. And that seems to be very much in the spirit of making of philanthropy, trying to make the system more equal and accountable and inclusive by actually funding that conversation to happen.
Fantastic. So Mo Ibrahim, African philanthropist, giving money in areas where perhaps we don't even think about philanthropists operating, on the governance space, improving civil society. And the Mo Ibrahim Index, African leaders now watch that. Every year it's announced. It's become part of our society. So that's creating change within our countries, and that shows you that really philanthropy can be part of the solution. And I think I'm glad you raised that example. And has also been, you could say, a positive force for change, spurring African leaders to step down when maybe they may have stayed in power, as well as reforming their own system. So great example, I'm glad you raised that. When we talk about philanthropy, it's not just Western, it's also African. I think that's the other point you're raising. Asha, thoughts about how philanthropy can help transform the system? You brought us back to our theme, transforming philanthropy. What are some maybe practical ways that philanthropy can transform the system and address inequality?
Well, one thing that just comes up that I was having a conversation with somebody over lunch about was, this is a very small thing, but I don't think people should get credit for pledging to give. I think they should get credit for actually giving, because regular people never get credit for pledging to give, right? Only very wealthy people do. And I think, the thing that I would say is how can philanthropy work together with, we all have a different definition of what that even means. Are we talking about institutional philanthropy, high net worth philanthropy, everyday giver philanthropy? But for all of us to work together to shift as much more power and agency as we can outward and into communities. And that's totally totally doable, and we can absolutely work together to achieve it.
Wonderful. Okay, now we have time for questions. I don't know if anyone has, I see some questions, but we also got some through the app. So I'm going to maybe ask one of the questions from the app, but before we do that, I'd ask each of the three panelists to just summarize. They've talked a lot about what is wrong with the system, critiques of the system, how we can fix it. What is your hope for philanthropy? We're in 2023. We've been through a pandemic, social justice, racial justice, and now economic crisis in pretty much every single country that we study. What is your hope for philanthropy in this moment? And how can we transform philanthropy? One word, and then your hope.
Word. I think action, stop the rhetoric, and actually move the money more proximately to groups on the ground.
Very simple action, proximate, give money to people, give communities power, I think is what you're saying. Yes, Asha, over to you.
I guess I would pose a thought experiment, which is if you are in the position of giving away money and you had to, for one calendar year, you were not allowed to give a single dime to a registered 501c3 nonprofit, but you had to disperse your 5% and you had to continue to meet your mission, how would you do it?
Okay, so what is your hope for philanthropy? You've given us the thought experiment. What would you like to see different?
The same thing Dakin said. Rhetoric into action. Make it manifest.
Okay. Matthew, I guess, last word goes to you on this, so we're counting on you to come up with the closing statements here.
Well, I'd like to see a lot more philanthropy, particularly by people who've signed pledges that they're going to do it. And I'd like it to be much bolder and more risk-taking. And I'd like there to be much more empowering of other people to do the work that they know needs doing in their own communities rather than imposing outside views on how people should do things.
So boldness, risk-taking, fewer restrictions, give communities power. I think round of applause to all three panelists. Okay, so I'm going to just ask, there were three questions that came in on the app. I just want to try to summarize what those questions were, the themes were around. We heard about boldness, we heard about courage, and I just want to throw out a number here. In terms of the financing gap for the SDGs, we hear about $4 trillion is needed. And you might think 4 trillion, that's a lot of money, but it turns out the world has, of course, the US alone, $4 trillion is to spend on the SDGs. And the question is really perhaps one of boldness, one of courage, and perhaps, as you said, thinking differently about how we solve problems. So what the questions all centered around was how do we, I think all the questions were around inequality, the least vulnerable in our societies, and the people that are most marginalized. How do we bring their voices to the table? So Dagan, I'm just going to ask you about that question because you seem to have a lot of thinking around that particular topic. In this conversation, we haven't spent as much time talking about the least able to speak, whether those are individuals with disabilities, historically marginalized groups. How can we bring their voices to the center of this conversation?
Well, I mean, I think it's about the structures that we've created are wrong, and we need to build new structures. You're trying to solve the SDGs, but where does majority of the resources go? It goes to the UN and multilateral institutions. To me, that is the center of the problem. That's why we went from MDGs to SDGs, and we'll go to something else in another 10 years. The only way you can lift people out of poverty is through industrialization. That's what China did. And it's through really strong government policies and through industrialization. But here in the South, we're told that you can't industrialize, especially now with climate change. We're told fossil fuels are bad. You've industrialized in the north, but we can't do that in the south. And so for me, I just don't see another, and then now with technology and AI, industrialization might not even be a possibility. Now we're going to another phase of technology. So there's a lot of issues about, a lot of concerns I have about the possibilities of us being able to realistically lift our millions and millions of people out of poverty, particularly in the continent, when we have so many resources on the continent. But we are still seen as a source of extraction of raw material rather than a source of actually the final product, coming from Africa. I always use example, when was the last time anybody has had a chocolate bar from Ghana? The biggest cocoa producer, I think one of the top 3, I think, in the world. And I did meet a Ghanaian woman in Unga who had started up a business with her sister. I forgot the name of the chocolate company. I said I would promote it, so I'm going to try to find the name and promote it online. But yeah, that will be the first company that will hopefully be selling Ghanaian chocolate bars in the West. So these are the kinds of real practical inequalities that exist for us. So unless we address the root causes of poverty and why the SDGs are even needed, we're never going to solve the problems.
So Dagan, I'm going to give you some homework. Before the conference, I want you to find that chocolate bar company, give us the name, share it on the app so that all of us know about it. Okay. 50. Thank you. Okay, she's going to share it with us. All right. Before we end and open it up for questions, it just occurred to me that we've had, I'd say, a very lively discussion, but it hasn't necessarily reached a resolution. So I'm also going to ask the panelists to tell us what makes them most hopeful and optimistic at this time. So in addition to the challenges, what makes you hopeful and optimistic? And Asha, I'm going to start with you.
Definitely our Giving Tuesday global community. I mean, I think another answer to the same question that you just asked is, and the reason I posed the organized, our sort of insistence on only funding organized charities, is that there is tremendous amount of work being done on the ground by distributed ecosystems of human beings who are interconnected and who are working together toward a common mission. And that's what gives me hope. What we are is basically a platform, not a literal platform, but a global metaphorical platform that people can step onto and use their own voice and their own co-ownership and have that voice amplified and receive the support and the moral support of an entire network of people who are trying to make positive change in their own communities so that they don't feel alone and siloed. They can avoid mistakes that have already been made. They can adopt other best practices. That type of distributed system has so much potential, and people feel less alone in it.
Matthew, one word or one thought in terms of what gives you hope right now.
Well, actually, can I just answer quickly Dagan's point? Because I do think you're absolutely right. There is this, the North, the West is basically, having extracted wealth for 3 centuries, is now saying to address climate change, we want to carry on having our lives and we want you to slow down in some sense. They're saying that by their actions, not necessarily by their words. And I do think that the only way, really, that the rest of the world outside of the West is going to take climate change as seriously as it needs to is if there is a massive shift in the terms of trade between the West and the rest. And if I was a philanthropist, if I was advising philanthropists on this, I would say devote in all your energy to somehow changing the politics in the West around that issue so that there is a system that genuinely promotes addressing this historic injustice that's there. Because fundamentally, as we heard this morning, climate change is real. It's accelerating. It's going to hurt the poorest parts of the world much more than it's going to hurt the rest. And so whilst I completely understand a position that says let's industrialize like China did, I think that would be catastrophic done the way China did it, which is now causing problems within China as China reaches its own internal political contradictions. But you know, Africa, there are a whole load of things that Africa could do. It could become the renewable energy powerhouse of the world and industrialize that way. It needs a lot more investment to come in and help, help make that industry take off and so forth. Which again, philanthropy can help change the political environment to do that. But to replicate the failed models of the West, because it doesn't seem to me the right way to address the historical injustices. But equally, I am completely fed up with the politicians of the West and their total failure to address any of this stuff with the seriousness of action that is merited by the severe crisis that we're in, that is going to upset millions or billions of lives over the next 20 or 30 years. So, we've just got to be real about that. And I hope that in fact, I do see leadership coming from all around the world, particularly the next generation of leaders that really understand that we need a cooperative, collaborative way forward here that involves radically different lifestyles by everybody, and not the old consumerist model that we've seen before. But I completely recognize that the political leaders in the countries that I've grown up and lived in are so disgracefully bad that they've really have no standing here, and I can understand why people are turning to other leadership models. But I hope that doesn't lead to a repeat or even worse mistakes than have happened historically.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to quickly just thank you all for joining us, say that our panelists have done an amazing job showing us, first of all, that we have lots of ideas in terms of how to transform the system. Our world needs these ideas, whether it's climate, inequality, education, health. There is no shortage of opportunities for philanthropy to play a role, but all of the panelists have said that it's not going to come from just one sector. We need governments. We need the private sector. I think Degan made that point. And we need people, everyday citizens, social entrepreneurs, to work together. So I'm going to leave you all with just 3 points. Number one, we have a role to educate on new ways of doing things to transform the world. Advocate for these, working with governments, and finally, collaborate. We need more collaboration. I think all of you have shared that, and collaboration starts with all of you in the room. So please join me again. Let's thank our panelists and continue this discussion throughout the conference.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Thank you very much. Another round of applause for the panel here. We had Asha, Digan, Matthew, and of course,